What's going on, everyone? In this tutorial, we're going to make a to-do list in React similar to the one on the screen. We're going to have the ability to create new to-dos, edit them, complete them, delete them, everything that you might need on a basic to-do list. And we'll also have the ability to store and load them using the browser's local storage. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do to get started is create a new React app using the tool Create React App. So go ahead and navigate in your terminal to a folder that you want to build your project in and use the command npx create react app followed by the name of the project, and I'm going to call mine to-do list. This process can take a couple of minutes. Great, now once your project is set up like this, we can go ahead and navigate into the folder using the cd or change directory command. And if you're using Visual Studio Code, one quick way to open the project is going to be to use the command code dot. And this should open up our application in a new Visual Studio Code instance. And for this tutorial, we're going to be working in the app.js file, so you should be seeing something similar to this. We're also going to go ahead and get the app started in the browser so that we can start developing on it. So go ahead and enter the command npm start in your folder. Alright, now once your application is running in the browser, you should see something similar to this. And we're going to be using the app.js component for this tutorial, but we actually don't need some of this boilerplate code. So go ahead and delete everything between the two divs that we have here. We're really just going to be starting from scratch here. And additionally to that, if you have a newer version of Create React App, we're also going to want to import React. So at the top, import React from React. And this will be necessary to use our React hooks to be able to access them. And for this tutorial, we are going to be creating a to-do list, and we're going to save our to-dos in an array of objects. Each to-do is going to be an individual object, and we can go ahead and set this up by adding a new custom hook. We're going to be using the useState hook, and we're going to call this hook to-dos. So go ahead and add the useState hook. If you haven't used this hook before, don't worry, I'll explain it in a second. And we're simply going to add a const array, and inside this array we'll have our to-dos and a set to-dos value, and this will be equal to react.useState, and we will set this to be default of an empty array. And I'm going to make this a little smaller, that way we have the full screen. If you haven't used a useState hook before, essentially how this works, this is built into React, and we have access to a variable that we can declare. In this case, we're going to call it to-dos. This is going to be our array, and its default value is going to be whatever we pass into this useState method here. In this case, just an empty array because we won't have any to-dos to start. And this second value is going to be our setter function. And so this setter function, set to-dos, is going to set this value of to-dos, and we're going to use this every time we add to-dos to our array. Additionally to that, we're going to want to keep track of the current to-do we're adding. So we can make a second hook, and we'll say to-do and set to-do, and we will set this equal to react.useState with some empty quotes. And you'll see where we're going to use this in a second. These are just our first basic hooks that we're going to want to be using. And so now let's go down into our markup, and we can create a form element and really get started with this project. So first, create a form, and inside this form we are going to want to have an input where we can type our values into, and we can go ahead and give this a type of text because it's going to be a text input. And underneath this input, let's go ahead and also add a button, which we can label add to do. And this button type is going to be a submit button type. And now if we go ahead and save our project, our default boilerplate code should disappear, and we will instead see our input show up. All right, so we've got our text input here. This is where we're going to be typing in our to-dos, and we've got our input, our button for add to do, so we can submit a form event. And the next thing that we're going to want to do is wire up this input so that whenever we type in any text, it will be applied to our to-do hook variable up here. And the way we can do that is we will add an onChange handler onto this input, and we'll set this equal to some curly brackets, and in these curly brackets we will pass in an arrow function, and we will use the hook function that we made earlier, set to do. And the reason that we're going to want to use an arrow function here, because we actually want to pass the text that we're trying to set. And so we are actually going to use the event, or E, here. So go ahead and pass this into your arrow function. And this E, or event, is simply a form event. So anytime you use a button or an input, the browser JavaScript gives you access to this E value, and this is going to be where we can take the text from our input. And the way to access that is going to be to pass in e.target.value to our function. And so E is an event object, like I mentioned, and target is simply going to be this input that we've created already, and value is going to be the value of that input. Additionally, we're also going to want to add a third property onto this input. We're going to want to add a value, and we will set this equal to our to-do. And so this onChange handler here is going to set our to-do hook variable to whatever we type in, and this function is going to run every time we type something in. And this value here is simply saying make sure the value of this input is whatever our to-do value is. That way, if we set our to-do outside of this input, the input will reflect whatever we're showing. And this is what's called a two-way data binding. It's a good practice to have, especially if you're going to be using additional functions that will change this value. And we can even see what's going on here. If you go ahead and open up your developer tools in your console, and if you don't already, make sure to have React developer tools installed. They're really useful. We can actually see the values for our hooks here. And if we start typing in here, we'll see whatever text we put in will show up in our developer tools. And that's how we know that our onChange function is working here. So this is our this is how we wire up the input. And now we're going to want to be able to add this to-do to our to-dos array. So next, go ahead up to your form element, and we will add an onSubmit handler here. And this onSubmit handler will run anytime a button with a type of submit is clicked. And so we will pass in a function that we haven't made yet, but we'll be making in just a second. So add the handle submit function. And we won't be passing anything into this. So we don't need to use an arrow function. We can just call the name of the function like this. We could also, if we wanted to, make this an arrow function, but it's not necessary in this case. And we'll go up underneath our hooks. Now we're going to add a function that will run when the form is submitted. So we can call this function, we already called it handle submit, so let's do that. And again, since this is a form handler, we will have access to this same E value. And so we are actually going to want to use this because by default, forms will refresh the page when they're submitted, and we don't want that. So the first thing that we can do in our function is add this prevent default method. This is a common practice in React because, again, like I said, by default, if we don't, before I save it, if we don't, then when we submit our form, if you might have noticed there was a refresh on the page, which we don't really want. And now when we have our e.prevent default, the page won't refresh when we click this add to do button. Get rid of this real quick. And so we can type something in here and we'll see the page didn't refresh on us. So that's just a good thing to have when you're submitting a form. And now we'll want to make our object for our to-dos array for the first to-do, which we've already assigned to the to-do variable. So what we can do is create a new object, and we will call this object new to-do. And we'll apply some properties to this object. The first one that we'll want is an ID. Anytime you're using multiple objects, it's a good practice to have an ID just to differentiate between your objects. And we'll want this to be a unique variable. So one way we can do this is we can set this equal to a new date object, and we can use the getTime method. And so we really just need a unique value here, and this here will give us the number of milliseconds after 1970. So this should give us a unique time every time we run the function. And after that, we can add another property to our new to-do. We'll add the text of this to-do, and we can set this equal to our to-do hook that we declared and set earlier. And lastly, we can have a completed value. We'll default this to false just because the to-do is not going to be completed at first. And so this will set up a new to-do for us. And now we can call the set to-dos function that we created earlier. And what we're going to want to do here is take in what our current to-dos are and add our new to-do to it. And one way to do this is we can use the spread operator to clone our to-dos variable. It's already an array, and this won't matter in the first case, but once we add multiple to-dos, this will simply take our to-dos array and make a new array out of it. And this is just to prevent mutating the data. Just a good practice in React. Anytime you're using arrays or objects, if you copy your array or object first, then you won't have to worry about mutating the original data. And we can concatenate on our new to-do. And so this will add our new object into our to-dos array. And after this, I think it would be best if every time we added a new to-do, we reset the input and made it blank, because we're not going to be wanting to add that same to-do. So here we can use the set to-do singular function, and we can pass in an empty string just to restore this second hook to its default value of an empty string. And now we should have access to our to-dos should be wired up properly when we submit them. One way we can find this out, let's go ahead and output them all as well to the screen. We're going to want to be doing this anyways. So let's go under our form element in our JSX, and we'll add some curly brackets to get into JavaScript, and we will map over our to-dos. So we'll use todos.map. And if you haven't used map before, this is a JavaScript method that will go through each element of an array, and it will return some value. In this case, we're going to be wanting to return our HTML or our JSX for our to-do. And map takes in an arrow function. We will be naming each individual element in that array by, we'll call it to-do. And this is just an arbitrary variable or value that we're going to use to access each element in our array. And we can immediately return a div here, and inside this div we can access with some curly brackets our to-do.text. And so if we go ahead and save this code right here, should display our to-dos to the screen now that they're connected to this to-dos hook value. So we can go ahead and start adding to-dos. Say eat pizza. I'm actually going to make this a little bigger just so everyone can see. And now you'll notice we have a to-do list set up. We can add to-dos, and they are also appearing to the screen. So that's great. That's the first step. We've got a working to-do list, and now let's enhance it a little bit. Let's go ahead and add a delete button just in case we want to delete any of our to-do values. So inside our map div that we created here, and actually before we do that, if you go to your console, you'll see there's a warning here. Each child in a list should have a unique key prop. We can get rid of this warning by going to this opening div tag here and setting a key value of something that's unique. And since we made an ID earlier, let's access our todo.id here. And if we go ahead and save again, give it a refresh, we'll notice that this error should go away. Loading a little slow here, but we've got no errors anymore. We can add our eat pizza to do again. Should appear again, no warnings. So let's go back into our div now. We're going to be adding some buttons inside this div so we can split it off into a few lines. And I'm going to surround this to do text by a div as well, just to keep things organized. And underneath this to do text, we can add a delete button. So let's go ahead and do that. And we can just add a button with the text delete. And we're going to want to put an on click handler on this button. That way we can run a function when we want to delete this to do. And let's go ahead and pass an arrow function in. We're going to call a function we haven't created yet, but it's going to be called delete to do. And we're also going to want to specify which to do to delete. So we can pass in the todo.id into this function. And again, arrow functions are useful, especially when you want to be passing in a specific variable to your function. So let's go ahead and make that function now. Underneath your handle submit function, let's create a delete to do function. And this function will also have the parameter of ID, which we'll pass in. That's the to do ID we're passing in here. And how we're going to do this is we're going to take our to-do list and we're simply going to filter out the to-do that we're trying to delete, the to-do with this ID. So one way we can do this, we'll set a variable for our new to-dos. And you know what, let's call this updated to-dos just to be a little more specific. And here we can use the same trick to spread over our to-dos array so we are not mutating the data. And we'll go ahead and filter this array. Filters like map, it's another array function in JavaScript, and it will take an arrow function, and we can use the name to do to reference each individual element in this array. And so how filter works is if you return a truthy or true value, true boolean, then it will include that element in the array. If you return a false value, then it will not return that value. So we're going to want to be shortening our to-dos array by taking out our to-do with the ID of ID. So we can say return only the values where the to-do.id is equal to, or is not equal to. So we're using the not equal ID. And this will be true for every to-do except the one we're deleting. And so this should give us a updated to-dos, and this should be updated to-dos, sorry. An updated to-dos array that is one shorter than the to-dos array we had before. And we can set our to-dos to be our updated to-dos. And if this works, we should be able to save and delete our eat pizza to do. I think we might need to refresh first. So we'll add this eat pizza and we can delete it. Awesome. So we've got our delete functionality. Next thing that we're going to want to add is a checkbox for whether or not the to-do's been completed. So underneath your delete to do, go ahead and add another input. And this input is going to have the type of checkbox. And so this will be, I'll add another to do so we can see the checkbox. So we've got a checkbox here, and every time we click on the checkbox, we can run a function using the onChange handler, similar to the other input. And we're going to want to make a function here as well. We'll use an arrow function so that we can specify which to do we want to toggle, and we can call this toggle complete. Alright, so we will pass a to-do.id into this toggle complete function, and we will call this function, or we'll declare this function above. And this function is going to be somewhat similar to our delete to do function, except this time instead of removing a to do, we're just going to want to modify a singular one of the to dos. So we can go ahead and use a similar pattern. We'll say our updated to dos are equal to our spread to dos, and we'll use the map method. And the map method, like I mentioned earlier, will return a specific value for each to-do in our array to make our new updated to-dos array. And so I'm going to open some curly brackets here because we're going to want to use a couple lines to do this. And the first thing that we can do is we can add an if statement, and we can say if the to-do.id is equal to the ID that we pass in. So this means if this is the to-do we're updating, then we can say take the to-do.completed value and set this equal to the opposite of whatever it is. So exclamation point to-do.completed. And this will modify the completed value of whichever to-do we're trying to modify. Lastly, after our if statement, we can return that to-do. And this return will return every to-do in our array, but only it will only modify the one we're trying to change. And after that, outside of our updated to-dos function, we can go ahead and use a similar pattern from earlier. We can set our to-dos equal to our updated to-dos. All right, so we've got the function working. We'll test it out in a second. One more thing we're going to want to add to this input here is we're going to want to give it a checked property here. So go ahead and add this onto your input. And I'm going to drop this onto a couple lines just so we can see what we're doing. And this checked value is going to be equal to the to-do.completed property on the to-do object. And so this checked is simply going to take in a Boolean value. This is either going to be true or false. If it's true, it'll be checked off. If it's false, it'll be not checked off. And now we can even test this out by going into our developer tools and looking at our to-dos array. And we should be able to check this off and have this become true. So that's how we know that our completed checkbox is working. So that's our delete and our completed functionality. Now let's go ahead and keep going to our editing to do functionality. So this one's going to be a little more complicated than the delete and the complete, but we'll get it done. So let's go ahead and add a button now, and this is going to say edit to do. And so in order to get this edit to do working, we're actually going to want to go back up to the top and add some new hooks. And we are going to want to first add a hook for to do editing. And we'll also add a set to do editing function that we can call to adjust that. And we'll set this equal to react.useState. And this will be null by default. And the reason for that is this to-do editing value is going to be an ID. It's going to be the ID of the to-do that we're editing. And to start out, we are not going to be editing anything, so we can set this to null. We're also going to want to keep track of the text that we're going to change the to-do that we're editing to. So we can say, we can call this editing text. And we'll also set up a function called set editing text, and you'll see the pattern here. This is pretty arbitrary, but it's just camel case for each element in these arrays with set in front of the variable name. And we'll set this equal to react.useState, and we'll pass in an empty string. And we'll use this in a second, but this is what we're going to be editing our text to before we click our submit button, because we're going to want a submit edits button. So the way that we're going to do this is we'll click the edit to do button, and then the text value here that we created above is going to change into an input that we can start adjusting that value in. So on our button, we can add an on click, and in this on click, we can add an arrow function, and we can call our set to do editing. And again, this is going to take in an ID of the to do we want to edit. So we can pass in that same to do.id. And we will, once we click this button, we're going to want to have this text value, this to-do.text above. We're going to want to change this into instead an input. And this input, we can create it now. It's also going to be type of text like our input from earlier. And it's also going to take in an onChange method. And this onChange method, we'll also want to use the event variable to grab the text from it. And we will say set editing text. And again, this is the text that we're editing. It's the fourth hook we made above. And we'll pass the e.target.value. And lastly, we'll also want to set the value equal to our editing text. So this is the same pattern we did above. We're using the two-way data binding again. And we can even drop these on to different lines just so that you can see everything that's going on again. And now we have two options to display, but we're only going to want to display one of these at a time. So let's go ahead and do some conditional rendering now. So what we can say is whatever to-do that we're editing, and remember this is an ID, this is the third hook we made above, if it's equal to the to-do.id, the current to-do that we're mapping over, then we will use a ternary operator. And so if you haven't used these before, a ternary operator takes in a Boolean value. If it's true, it returns whatever's in the first parentheses before the colon. If it's false, it will return another set of parentheses. And so if it's true, if it is the to-do we're editing, we'll cut this input and put this into our first value. And if it's false, then we can put our to-do text that we had earlier into our second value. And so again, there looks like there's a lot going on here, but we can separate it a little bit. What we're doing is if this to-do editing, if this Boolean is true, if it's the to-do we're editing, show an input. Otherwise, just show the text. All right, so this should, if we go ahead and give this a save, now if we add another to-do, if we hit this edit to-do button, all of a sudden we see an input here where we can edit our to-do, and we can maybe say eat cake. And this is great. We've set this to-do value. We just now need to submit our edits. And the way we're going to do that is we will add another button here. And we can say submit edits just underneath this edit to do button. And this will take an on click. And again, we'll pass in an arrow function. And we will we'll be calling a function that we also haven't made yet called edit to do. And this function will again take in the to-do's ID. And so we can create that function now. If we go under our toggle function, we can add a function for edit to do, which will also take in an ID. And a similar pattern to this toggle complete, we will say const updated to-dos. This is where we'll store our new to-dos. We'll again spread over our to-dos, and we will map over them, passing in the to-do value. And it's pretty much going to be the same as our toggle complete function. We will say if the to-do.id is equal to the ID. And again, this is if it's the to-do that we're editing. Then we will say to-do.text equals, and we will set this equal to the editing text, our fourth hook that we made above. And then after that, we will return the to-do. And again, this return is going to return every to-do, but if it's the one we're editing, it will modify it first. And underneath this, we can set our to-dos value, and we'll set it equal to, again, our updated to-dos. And before we finish this function, let's also reset our third and fourth hook, our editing text, and our to-do editing. So we can say set to-do editing. and we'll set this back to null. This is the ID of the to-do we're editing, and we'll set our editing text, and we'll set this back equal to an empty string. And this is just to reset our editing logic. And again, these names are arbitrary. If you want to arrange them differently, if you want to name them differently, feel free to do that. This is just for example. And so now if we go ahead and save it, we should be able to edit our to-dos. So let's go ahead and give it a refresh. We'll add eat pizza, and we'll edit our to-do, and we can change this to eat cake. Awesome. So we've got our editing functionality working. We successfully modified the text on this to-do. And one thing that we can do to clean this up a little bit is we have an edit to-do button. We have a submit edits button. But I think it would be better if we only show one of these buttons at a time. So go ahead and scroll down to the bottom two buttons we've created. And we'll use a similar conditional rendering pattern that we used with the input or the text value. So we can say if the to-do we're editing is equal to the current to-do ID we've mapped over, then use a ternary operator. And so if it is the to-do we're editing, then we will add this submit edits button. So we can cut this and put this in here. And otherwise, we'll put the other button in our second value. And it does seem like there's a lot going on here, but just keep in mind, if you set up your question mark and your colon and just have two empty parentheses, it can definitely simplify things. So now if we go ahead and save and refresh, we will see our editing should only show one button at a time. If we add pizza, we only see the edit button. And if we hit edit, we only see the submit edits button. Awesome. So we've got a working to-do list. We've got a bunch of functionality. We can display it to the screen, delete, check for completed. We can edit. And lastly, I think the way to finish this to-do list off, one thing that I found is really useful is using local storage to save our to-do data. Because if we hit refresh here, our to-dos are going to go away, but what if we want to come back to this to-do list later? And so underneath your use state hooks, we're going to go ahead and use a use effect hook. And so let's create one now. React.useEffect. This is another method that's accessible in the React library, and we can pass an arrow function into it. And we'll also want to add a comma and a array here. And this is going to be what's called our options array. So how useEffect works, if you've never used it before, this function here will run, if we leave this array empty, this function here will run once when the component is mounted or at the start. Right when the page is loaded, the component, whatever code we put in here will get loaded. If we pass a state or a props variable into here, then this function will run every time that variable changes. And so the way we can save our data is if we go ahead and pass our to-dos array variable in here, then every time this to-dos array changes, this function will get run. And so what we can do to save our values is we can go ahead and create a new variable. We're going to want to turn our array into JSON. We're going to want to stringify it into JSON before we pass it into the browser. So we can make a temporary variable. I'm just going to call it JSON, lowercase. And we're going to use the uppercase JSON. And this is actually really an arbitrary name. We can really call this whatever we want. But I'm just going to call it that for simplicity. And this uppercase JSON is going to give us access to some methods such as stringify, which we're going to be using here. And what this will do is it will turn any JavaScript into JSON. So we can pass our to-dos in, and they will be converted into JSON. And after that, we can take our local storage, and we can use the set item method. And this method takes in two values. The first is going to be a string for where we can access this data. And so again, this is arbitrary. I'm just going to call it to-dos. You can feel free to call it whatever you want here, but it's just a way to pull up our data later. And we'll also add a second value with our temporary JSON value here. And we can even rename this temp if we wanted to, just so we don't confuse ourselves with this uppercase JSON. So we've got our temporary value here. And after that, so this is how we save our data into local storage. What if we want to retrieve it? Because if we refresh the page, we're going to need to load that data. So above this useEffect hook or below it, we're going to add another React.useEffect hook. And this time we'll leave the array empty because we only want to run this once when we load the page. And what we can do here is we can say we'll use another const, and we'll create another temporary variable, and we will access the local storage with the get item method. And this get item method takes in one argument, and that is simply the string that we associated this data with earlier. So it'll be to-dos in this case. And now we are going to need to parse this data because this temp is a JSON, isn't JSON, but we're going to want it in JavaScript. So we could say, we'll say const loaded to-dos, we'll make a new variable, and we will use the JSON.parse method on our temp value. And now that we've got our loaded to-dos in, we actually don't want to set them yet because we need to check to make sure there actually are loaded to-dos. If this is the first time a user's using this application, we don't want to set any to-dos. So let's go ahead and we'll say if loaded to-dos, just to make sure we have something there. Then we can say set to-dos to our loaded to-dos. Awesome. Now if we give it a save and a refresh, we should have our application working. Let's see if it does. So we have a value here. I think that was from my cache from earlier, but I'm going to delete this. We'll add a another to-do. This one says eat pizza. Now if we refresh, we have eat pizza again. And so also if we complete it, give it a refresh, we'll see our to-do is completed. If we edit it, go back to eat cake, we'll submit our edits. If we refresh, it'll still say eat cake. And again, we can delete it, refresh, and it's empty. So here we go. We've got a working to-do list with lots of features. I hope you got something out of this. I mean, we use React useState, React useEffect, and a lot of little React form logic and patterns here. So hope you enjoyed it. If you did, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. If you want to see more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We're making more videos all the time. And thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.